Nigeria's independence was an event as monumentous as the end of World War II, at least for the people of Africa's most populous nation.
1960 October, now the battle is over. This is the date we've been waiting to celebrate. Nigeria is free.
Independence brought so much hope to Nigerians. After all, Nigeria had what it needed to become a thriving, self-governed nation, including some of that crude oil that everyone seems to want. With all these, the average Nigerian viewed independence with a keen optimism that you'd be tempted to think, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it did go wrong. Not even 10 years after Nigeria gained independence, the nation was plunged into a civil war that claimed more than 2 million lives. Millions starved to death. Many atrocious things happened. And while it's fair to say that Nigeria's first military coup was the first start, the seed of civil war had been sown since 1914. Now, if you've ever read a bit of Nigerian history, the 1914 amalgamation of the Southern and Northern Protectorate by the British to form Nigeria shouldn't sound strange to you. That being said, the one thing that the British seemed to forget, or probably didn't care about, was that they had just joined over 350 different tribes together. Among them were the Hausa, Yoruba and Igbo, the three major tribes. The three tribes had one thing in common: they weren't particularly fond of each other. That makes you wonder when the British decided to lump these three guys together and just expect them to like each other. I'm guessing it has something to do with money. Lots of it. Anyway, the formation of Nigeria, the three big boys were now stuck together. They had to find a way to somehow make things work. For a while, they did. Resentments towards continued British rule was a sentiment shared by the three tribes. They worked together to try to end it. They formed various political parties, newspapers, and radio networks to mount a strong opposition to the British government. In the north, Ahmadu Bello, the leader of the Northern People's Congress. In the west, Obafemi Awolowo, the leader of the Action Group. And in the east, Nnamdi Azikiwe led the National Congress of Nigeria and the Cameroons. All three men would go on to lead their respective regions later on. Fighting a common enemy didn't exactly make them best buddies. They still disagreed over a number of issues. One of them was the timing of independence. While the Western and Eastern region wanted independence as early as 1956, the North wanted it much later to give them time to play catch-up. Since they were particularly behind the other two regions, they feared the Southern domination of post-independence Nigeria, and so they kicked against the proposed 1956 independence, opting for a more practical date. This sparked the 1953 Northern Riot that left many dead on both sides, and directly resulted to Southerners fleeing the North in their thousands. It was one of the first signs of the kind of disunity that would soon become part of Nigeria. To put it simply, Nigeria was a nation made of three major tribes that didn't trust each other. The founding fathers, although quite intelligent people, were also very ambitious. At independence, Ahmadu Bello's MPC chose to form an alliance with Azikiwe and the NCNC rather than the more ambitious Awolowo. Instead, Awolowo was left with leading the official opposition. Rather than make himself prime minister, Ahmadu Bello decided to make his deputy, Tafawa Balewa, the prime minister, while he oversaw things in the north. For Azikiwe, he was given the position of governor general. These meant the major players in the new Nigeria were in power one way or the other. So everyone should be happy, right? Well, not exactly. The thing is, the post-independence political structure only seemed to favor the Northerners. Awolowo wasn't exactly happy being the head of the opposition, and Azikiwe's role was as significant as an observer in government. So despite the optimism of independence, Nigeria didn't start out particularly well. The British had somehow managed to create a union of different tribes whose interests only seemed to match for a while, and when their interests didn't align, things got ugly.
One thing I've noticed, Premier, while I've been here, is that Northerners seem to have, I might almost call it, obsession about the Igbos. Could you perhaps explain that to me?
Well, the Igbos are more or less the type of people whose desire is mainly to dominate everybody. If they go to a village, to a town, they want to monopolize everything in that area. If you put them in a labor camp as a laborer, within a year they will try to emerge as headman of that camp, and so on. Well, in the past, our people were not alive to their responsibilities, because you can see from our northernization policy that in 1952, when I came here, there weren't 10 northerners in our civil service here. Then I tried to have it northernized, and now all important posts are being held by northerners.
Listening to this just shows the kind of disunity and resentment that was growing between the three tribes, with the Igbos and Hausas at each other's necks. So when election came in 1964, it was essentially the Hausas against the Igbos. Awolowo's AG had lost his influence in the western region, and Awolowo himself was now in prison for financial misappropriation. But he wasn't the only politician guilty of that. In fact, many Nigerian politicians were only interested in amassing wealth rather than serving their country. For the average politician back then, the order was quite simple: himself, his family, and his tribe. The election was, as you've guessed it, a sham. There was rigging everywhere, as politicians employed every tactic outside of the book to win. The violence that followed claimed thousands of lives. With all these happening, the ordinary Nigerian watched and hoped something would change, and indeed, change was coming, but in a very unusual way.
Lagos, across the lagoon in the late afternoon sun, isn't a bad-looking city. Its troubles have been internal: weakness and corruption in the federal government, which rules the 4 regions of Nigeria. That basically is why the troops are in, why public buildings in Lagos have been under military guard for the last few days, and why, at any rate for the moment, the government is in the hands of General Aguiyi Ironsi, the army commander. The coup now begins to look more and more like a straightforward military revolt against corruption in government, and one that's likely to last.
In January 15, 1966, change came in the form of a military coup. At the center of the coup were 5 majors who aimed to eliminate many corrupt politicians. Led by Major Chupuma Nzogu, the coup plotters stormed the northern premier's house and killed him. Next, Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa and Finance Minister Okotie Ebo were arrested, and both of them would later turn up dead. In Ibadan, Chief Samuel Akintola, Premier of the Western region, was shot dead. Things in the Eastern region were slightly different. Eastern Premier Michael Okpara was detained but not killed. The coup plotters also took out all senior military officers except Major General Aguiyi Ironsi, who was the head of the army at the time. That meant that all politicians and senior army officers killed in January 1966 coup were not Igbo, a major flaw in the coup.
Major Nzogu, can you please give me an account of the night of the coup in Kaduna?
Well, it's rather something like the longest day. We started this off on the night of the 13th of January when a night exercise was planned by the military college, which I command. We took our troops to the ground and taught them how to do night attacks. We didn't tell them what we were planning for, but at the end of the exercise we took them out and showed them various places where they were to stand and just remain in their vehicle. Next day, we went out again for the same type of exercise, and at the end, we issued them with ammunition this time, live ammunition, and told them that they were going back to the same place as they went yesterday, but this time they were to get certain people.
And they were with you, were they?
Oh, of course they did. Oh, they all supported us.
Did the Sergeant owner himself attempt to fight?
Well, no. We didn't see him until the time we actually shot him. He ran away from his house when we fired the first few shots of anti-tank gun into the building. The whole roof was blown up and the place was set alight. Then we went to the rear of the house and started searching from room to room until we found him amongst the women and children, hiding himself. So we sort of took away the women and children and took him.
Now, what are your relations with General Iransi in Lagos?
Well, very good. He's my boss. I have always been under him, and I still am under him. There isn't really any problem. A few misunderstandings arose, but this was due to the publication in the press and by announcements over the radio. At one time, they started calling us in Kaduna rebels, whereas in fact the revolution was all a planned affair all over the country, and many other people were cooperating.
Now imagine you are a northerner watching all these happen. You see your most prominent leaders killed in a coup by soldiers mainly from another ethnic group. But somehow the coup failed to eliminate a single Igbo leader. Their most prominent leader was conveniently on vacation at the time of the coup. And then your worst nightmare happened. Power is handed over to an Igbo officer. You're probably sat there fuming, angry and waiting for an opportunity to get revenge. It's important to note, however, that the coup led by Nzogo was aborted by Irunsi and many other officers, and so it couldn't be considered an Igbo coup. For the North, it was simple. The Igbos had staged a coup to eliminate northern leaders and replace them with Irunsi and Igbo officers. Irunsi as Nigeria's new leader had all but sealed his fate. In an attempt to gain northern favor, he had surrounded himself with northern soldiers and arrested the perpetrators of the January coup. However, he didn't execute them like the North wanted. Instead, he kept them in prison. But the final nail in his coffin was his unification decree that reshaped the civil service from a regional one into a federal service, something the North had always been against. The Northerners were still healing from the wounds of the January 1966 coup, had begun to resent the Igbos deeply, and the hatred would directly result in Nigeria's second military coup. Around midnight on the 28th of July 1966, Northern soldiers at the Abeokuta barracks attacked and killed several Igbo soldiers. They justified the killing as a retaliation to the January coup. By the next morning, a bloody coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed and Major T.Y. Danjuma had overthrown Irunsi, and the then Western Region head Fajuya were both dragged into the bush and shot dead. With the Northern officers' successful coup, everything could now go back to normal. Well, not quite. In fact, things were about to get a lot worse for the Igbos, and Irunsi's death was just the beginning.
All foreigners in Nigeria are assured of their personal safety and should have no fear of being molested. We shall continue with vigor the policy of providing a climate conducive and attractive to foreign investors. They are assured of the protection and goodwill of my government.
In the wake of the July 1966 coup and Gowon's subsequent installation as the new head of state, the North carried out its long-awaited revenge on the Igbos. Thousands of Igbos living in the North were killed, beaten, and even their properties burned. This caused a massive exodus of the Igbos from the north to the east to seek refuge amongst their kinsmen. Amidst all the violence and chaos was one man, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, military governor of the Eastern region. Ojukwu had somehow avoided being overthrown in the July coup, and he had become increasingly vocal about the plight of the Igbos. He also rejected the appointment of Gowon as the military head of state, since he was merely the most senior officer in the north and not the most senior army officer. These and many other things would lead up to the Nigerian Civil War, or as many call it, the Biafra War.
In our case, that thousands have been massacred is not in dispute. One then might be permitted to ask, at what stage does this massacre become genocide?
In the aftermath of the events of July 1966, Ojukwu feared for the safety of the Igbos, especially in a country dominated by millions of people who hated the Igbos. Thus, he and Gowon met on a neutral ground in Aburi, Ghana for peace talks. Looking at Gowon and Ojukwu, you would think they were good friends. They seemed happy to be there. And maybe it was because the talks in Aburi had yielded results, at least for now. Ojukwu and Gowon had somehow managed to agree that would allow the eastern region to administer its own resources. Gowon would, however, go back on his word and reject the main points agreed at Aburi.
We will continue to operate the existing federal constitution and the federal system of government until a new constitution is drawn up. In Aburi, we made an excellent start in the bid for permanent peace, but let us not deceive ourselves that it was possible to solve all Nigeria's problems in the two-day meeting of minds of Nigeria's military leaders.
The reason was simple. Most of Nigeria's oil was concentrated in the eastern region, and Gowon wasn't going to miss out on all that oil because he wanted peace. Gowon's rejection of the eastern region's autonomy would result in Ojukwu's secession of the eastern region from Nigeria on the 30th of May 1967.
If civil war comes, and I do think it is imminent, you're quite right, it will for us be the price of freedom. Our people here have for a long time been prepared for this eventuality, and I am confident of their readiness. I think that when it does come, that the people on the other side would be surprised as to what they're going to get. And I'm confident that it will not last long.
To some extent, Ojukwu was right. Unlike the Nigerians, Biafra was going to be fighting for survival, and it meant that they would naturally fight harder. However, Gowon was not going to let them go away easily. Although Gowon failed to admit, his refusal to grant Biafrans autonomy was about oil as much as it was about ethnic issues. Gowon's first assault on Biafra came in form of a police action, Gowon's synonym for war, and so war began. On the 6th of July 1967, the 1st Battalion of the Nigerian Army attacked Ogoja, signaling the start of the war. Under the command of Colonel Mohammed Showa, the 1st Battalion launched Operation Unicord, taking the towns of Ogoja, Obudu, Gakam and Nsukka. They hoped for a quick and decisive victory against an ill-prepared and heavily under-equipped Biafran army, and it made perfect sense. The Biafran army had been hurriedly formed and contained mainly Igbo officers that used to serve in the Nigerian army, along with the volunteers from all around Biafra. Initially, the operation seemed to work, and Ojukwu would soon be forced to release some of the January 1966 coup plotters imprisoned in the eastern region. Major Chukwuma Nzogo, Timothy Onwatuegu, Emmanuel Ifajuna, and Lieutenant Colonel Victor Banjo were part of the officers released. Unfortunately, Nzogo would be killed in an ambush just weeks later on a reconnaissance mission. The Nigerian army took the towns of Ogoja, Obudu, Gakam and Nsukka in under 1 month of fighting. Within miles of Enugu, the Nigerian army decided to do something ingenious. Rather than make a direct advance to Enugu, they decided to make a different play, something Biafrans wouldn't see coming. On the 25th of July 1967, the 3rd Marine Commando Division under the command of Colonel Benjamin Adekunle launched a sea assault on Bonny, a strategic oil terminal. It seemed that after all, Gowon wanted that oil, and he knew that taking control of oil terminals meant Ojukwu would find it difficult to continue financing the war. Easy, right? Well, like everything in this war, taking Bonny was not going to be easy. Although the Biafran army had basically very little presence there, the Biafran army had a fairly okay navy that consisted of BNS Ibadan, commanded by Lieutenant Commander P.J. Odu, and boats that had been modified to include naval warfare capabilities. At around 4 a.m. on D-Day, NNS Nigeria, under the command of Captain Nelson Soro, and NNS Ogoja, Lieutenant Commander Akin Adua, set out to the coast of Bonny and heavily bombarded Biafrans positioned on the island. Then, NNS Lokoja, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Joe, successfully landed troops on the northern part of the island, cutting off chances of Biafran reinforcements from Port Harcourt. By the next day, Lieutenant Commander P.J. Odu, commanding BNS Ibadan, arrived, and a long battle ensued. He faced his old friend Lieutenant Commander Akin Adua, commanding NNS Ogoja, and although BNS Ibadan had superior firepower, Odu had to constantly deal with the issue of his gun jamming, which put him in a huge disadvantage and basically handed Akin Adua the win. With naval control secured, Biafran forces retreating and the mounting effect of Nigerian economy blockade against Biafra, Ojukwu knew he had to do something. Call it luck or tactical genius, but Ojukwu had something up his sleeve. He called it Operation Torch, and it was about to put Biafra back on the strong position. You see, although the Civil War was essentially Nigeria against Biafra, the Midwest region chose to remain neutral up until this point. So, the Nigerian army attacked Biafra only from the south and the north. Ojukwu's brilliant idea involved invading the Midwest region to divert attention from Enugu and possibly buy him time to better organize Biafra's defenses. As simple as it was, it caught the Nigerian army completely off guard. On the 8th of August 1967, Biafran soldiers from the 101st Division commanded by Colonel Victor Banjo crossed the Niger into Asaba. They took over Asaba swiftly and cut off all forms of communication in the city to prevent the Nigerian army from getting a heads up. Within days, the 101st Division split into 3 battalions, captured Warri, Sapele, Ughelli and Benin City, the capital of the Midwest. In Benin City, Ojukwu replaced the governor of the Midwest with an Igbo medical officer, Major Okonkwo. Next, the Biafran soldiers continued their advance to Lagos under Colonel Banjo's command. They were stationed in Ore and awaited further instructions. In the Midwest, Biafran forces now had total control of the area. Major Okonkwo's administration suppressed the indigenous tribes and only gave opportunities to people that sympathized with the Biafra cause. The citizens were also forced to donate food materials to Enugu, the capital of Biafra, in support of the war effort. For a people that seceded to avoid northern oppression, the Biafrans committed a lot of atrocities. Anyone who disagreed with the Biafran cause was arrested and sometimes executed. Now at this point, everything seemed to be going too well for Ojukwu. He had gone from being on the defensive to within just miles of Nigeria's capital, and thus, he began to feel a little too confident. He reorganized the captured Midwestern region into a new country named the Republic of Benin. This was his first mistake. Gowon recognized the imminent danger, declared all-out war on Biafra. Colonel Murtala Mohammed's 2nd Division attacked Biafran soldiers stationed at Ore under Colonel Banjo, forcing them to retreat. The retreating Biafran soldiers destroyed a lot of bridges on the way back to Benin to ensure their escape. However, it didn't stop the Nigerian forces advancing at lightning speed. In the next few days, the Nigerian army would retake all the Midwestern territories from the Biafran army. With the loss of the entire Midwestern region, Ojukwu had become extremely paranoid. He no longer trusted his top officers and began to believe they were planning to overthrow him. On the 22nd of September 1976, Ojukwu executed some of his senior officers, including Colonel Victor Banjo and Major Ifajuna. In the wake of these executions, the Nigerian army began their march on Enugu and laid siege on Biafra's capital. Bombs and artillery fire continuously rained down on Enugu, forcing residents to flee the capital city. Ojukwu himself was lucky to escape because he disguised as a servant. The Nigerian army hoped that by dealing consecutive blows to Biafra, Ojukwu would just turn around and surrender, but he wasn't going to go back down easily. Ojukwu instead relocated the capital of his administration from Enugu to Umuahia. Now that the Nigerian army controlled former Biafran territories, they sat them down and taught them the importance of one Nigeria. Of course not. The Nigerian army did what every army that takes over an enemy territory would do: commit atrocities. If the atrocities committed by the Biafran army made them demons, the Nigerian army was the devil himself. In what is now known as the Asaba massacre, they rounded up most of the able-bodied men into an open square and opened fire on them. It was a bloodbath. Wives, sons and daughters watched their fathers shot for virtually no reason. Most of the residents of Asaba still remember this infamous day as one of the darkest in their history. By late October, Onitsha was under siege. Nigerian artillery rained down hell on the city for 8 days straight. The Biafrans were only saved because their last-ditch effort to blow up the Niger Bridge had somehow worked. It prevented Nigerian troops from gaining direct entry into Onitsha. Colonel Murtala Muhammad then decided to cross Niger on boats with over 5,000 men. His idea turned out to be a success. The Nigerian forces were too many for the retreating Biafrans to handle. But instead of pursuing the retreating soldiers, the Nigerian soldiers just had to do something stupid. Colonel Muhammad and the rest of the Nigerian forces somehow decided that burning the Onitsha market was a more important objective than annihilating the Biafran soldiers. The Nigerians would pay dearly for it. Biafran soldiers from the 11th and the 18th Battalion cornered the Nigerian forces and defeated them. Undeterred, Murtala Muhammad would try again 2 more times but was defeated in each attempt. With a stalemate at Onitsha, the Nigerian forces turned their eyes to Calabar, another strategically important Biafran city. Nigerian forces under their 3rd Marine Commando attacked Calabar and overwhelmed the Biafran soldiers within days. The French mercenaries recruited by Ojukwu were about as useful as a pony in a battle. Eventually, Biafrans were forced out of Calabar. By January 1968, Nigerian troops led by Colonel Murtala Muhammad had crossed the Niger and were ready to begin a march towards Onitsha. Despite Murtala's strategic mistakes at the battle at Adani, the Nigerian army's astronomically larger army overwhelmed the Biafrans, and soon they were within touching distance of Onitsha. Despite being only 22 kilometers from Onitsha, Biafran tactician Lieutenant Colonel Achuzie managed to hold off a Nigerian army that outnumbered him and had much better equipment. The blockade had effectively cut off major supplies from the Biafran army, and the only weapons they had were either weapons taken from captured Nigerian soldiers or hand-me-downs from the French, who liked the possibility of breaking up a former British colony with lots of oil. Nigeria, on the other hand, were supplied with weapons constantly by the British, Soviet, and to some extent, the Americans. In the end, Achuzie's tactical genius could only hold them off for 2 months. Nigeria's superior firepower helped them take Onitsha, but their victory would soon be tainted by a significant loss. At the Battle of Onitsha, Colonel Murtala Muhammad had rushed into Onitsha with so much speed, leaving his supply line way behind. In an attempt to rejoin the main troop, Murtala's supply line was making its way to Onitsha. Unbeknownst to them, Achuzie had set up an ambush for them and they waltzed right into it. Either by a stroke of luck or good old military orders, a rocket launcher fired on a gasoline tanker and exploded and killed most of the convoy in an instant. The survivors scattered in different directions and missed all the noise and were picked off one by Biafran soldiers waiting in ambush. The ambush at Abagana still considered the most embarrassing defeat for the Nigerian army throughout the war, and for that, Colonel Murtala would be stripped of command for the remainder of the war. For the Biafrans, the huge victory didn't exactly translate into much. Their territories reduced with every battle, and a new enemy was on the horizon, an enemy that would threaten more than half of the entire Biafran population: starvation. The blockade prevented anything from getting to the Biafrans. No ammunitions, no tankers, and more importantly, no food. Children with kwashiorkor walked the streets, mothers unsure of where their next meal will come from. You kind of get the dire situation Biafra had found itself. On the battlefront, the Biafran army wasn't doing any better. They lost the strategic town of Afam, where Biafra's central power station was located. A widespread blackout followed that put about 80% of Biafran territories in darkness. Seeing as the Nigerian army had taken out key towns near Port Harcourt, Ojukwu sought to mount one last defense to prevent the city from falling into Nigerian hands. For this, he put Lieutenant Colonel Achuzie in charge of defending Port Harcourt. Up till this point, Achuzie had managed to deliver decisive battles for Biafrans. But in this case, the tactical knowledge was no match for the overall superiority of the Nigerian army. The Nigerians came at Biafra with everything they had, and in just a few days, Biafran soldiers had been completely pushed out of the city. So, with the loss of Port Harcourt, the Biafran army was basically sandwiched between different units of the Nigerian army. The morale of the Biafran soldiers was at an all-time low. People were starving, children dying in their thousands, and all the Nigerians had to do was attack them even harder. Naturally, the Nigerian government expected Ojukwu to come forward to decide the terms of surrender now that he was with his back to the war, but Ojukwu wasn't that man. He believed he could continue fighting. With the capture of most Biafran cities, the major cities left were Owerri, Aba and Umuahia. Colonel Benjamin Adekunle and the 3rd Marine Commando moved to capture the 3 remaining Biafran strongholds, capturing Aba in September 1968 with some of the worst artillery shelling throughout the war. Owerri fell next in mid-September to the soldiers of the Nigerian 16th Brigade. At this point, Umuahia was the last Biafran stronghold, and Ojukwu knew this was make or break time. Lose Umuahia and you can as well trash any hope of independence Biafra. Hoping for some kind of twist, Ojukwu turned to Colonel Obugo Kanu, appointing him as the commander of the 14th Division. Kanu was able to halt the rapid Nigerian advance briefly, but with little bit of time to reorganize, Nigerian forces turned to Umuahia to launch what they assumed would be their final offense. However, the Biafran soldiers were too much to handle. They mounted a strong resistance against Colonel Adekunle's forces, killing about 1/3 of the entire 3rd Marine Commando Division. Off the back of a successful defense, Biafran troops moved to recapture Owerri. Taking back Owerri proved to be an enormous task, and despite a Biafran victory, both sides suffered heavy casualties. The only difference was that Nigeria had an almost endless supply of soldiers and weapons. The Biafrans didn't have that luxury. So it's fair to say that despite capturing Owerri, the Biafran army had been severely weakened. However, that didn't translate into an easy Nigerian win. The Biafrans continued to defend Umuahia with everything they had, and by the 11th of April 1969, they had frustrated the Nigerian army enough to force them to seek air support. In the days that followed, Nigerian forces rained down heavy bombs on Umuahia. Next, they attacked Umuahia through the forest using track tanks. The Biafran soldiers were not expecting this kind of attack. Because of the nature of the attack, Nigerian soldiers took total control of Umuahia by 22nd April 1969. With Biafra's continued heavy losses, they looked for someone to blame. One easy target was a group of foreign oil workers, believed to be giving Nigerian armies information on Biafran positions. On the 7th of May 1969, Biafran commandos attacked an Italian oil facility in Kwale in mid-western Nigeria. They killed about 10 oil workers there and took a further 18 of them hostage. For a country that needed people to sympathize with its cause, that was a really bad move. As pressure continued to mount from the international community, Ojukwu was forced to let them go. Gowon, on the other hand, was planning his final assault on Biafra. For this purpose, he replaced his top military officers involved in the war effort, bringing in Colonel Bisala for Colonel Showo, Colonel Gibson Jallo for Colonel Motala, and Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo as commander of the 3rd Marine Commando Division. Despite the rousing words from Ojukwu, the Biafrans understood their situation. They needed to at least get one thing going for them. And then it happened. Some Swedish guy named von Rosen helped get the Biafran Air Force back to shape. Using their newfound air capabilities, the Biafrans launched bomb campaigns against Nigerian military assets. At first, it dampened Nigerian morale due to the destruction of many Nigerian aircrafts and even allowed Biafran forces to retake Port Harcourt. Things would change, however, with the arrival of Colonel Obasanjo. In December 1969, Obasanjo made a push to attack all the remaining Biafran strongholds, and by Christmas, he had taken out Ojukwu and was on his way to Uli. On the 7th of January 1970, Obasanjo's 3rd Marine Commando Division made their final push for the remaining Biafran territories. Realizing their impending loss, Ojukwu called for a meeting of Biafran leaders to decide the fate of the Biafran people. At the end of the meeting, Ojukwu handed the government over to his vice president, Philip Effiong, and boarded a helicopter to Ivory Coast. As all Biafran territories were now captured, Philip Effiong announced the surrender of Biafra, marking the end of the Civil War. To some extent, Gowon was right. Most of the countries that had interfered in the conflict didn't do so because they cared about peace or saving African lives. They did it to secure their oil interest, but Gowon himself was guilty of this. Although he had successfully crushed Biafra, the way he did it made people to question if his interests were actually national unity or oil like the foreigners. Looking back, many feel the war could have been prevented, millions of children could have been saved from starvation, and many soldiers that died in the war could be alive if only both parties had exercised some restraint. Oddly enough, Nigerians didn't seem to have learned from the events that led to the Civil War. In the words of George Santayana, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it.